It's an important topic, and I'm really pleased to be here today. I'm very grateful to Carly and to the Alliance for organizing this conference. When I spoke to Carly, I thought we really need to have a dialogue about trafficking in a broader sense than sometimes we have had in the past, because I think the more we're learning about the issue, the more we need to share that information so we can come up with the best responses possible. So I'm Carleen, I'm with World Vision, as Malcolm said, and we are a Christian advocacy, relief, development organization. We work in over 100 countries around the world. We work on a variety of sectors, education, health, economic development, but we do work around human trafficking, and that's the issue that I'd like to talk to you about today. I want to share some findings and some thinking from a report that we have called 10 Things You Need to Know About Labor Trafficking. If you Google it, you can find it online. We have just a few hard copies with us today, but I encourage you to download it instead of taking the paper copy. So I'd like to share some of my thinking and some findings with you, just so you have a sense. We do work around the world, so we have programming in South Asia, Southeast Asia, Eastern Europe, the Middle East, some parts of Africa, and as mentioned, I was in Haiti and the Dominican Republic looking at the situation there. So we do a variety of things. We work all the way from the prevention aspect to the restoration and justice piece, and I'll tell you a little bit about our work, but certainly the child for us is what's at the center of our work, and the child within his or her community is where we start. So the topic today is labor trafficking. So I know that it's not always clear what labor trafficking is, and that's because we don't have a lot of clear definitions. So we have the UN protocol from the Palermo Protocol, which I have up here. What is exploitation? What are the purposes? So we have sexual exploitation, which I think is easier to kind of wrap our minds around that terrible crime. But when we think of things like forced labor, slavery, slavery-like practices, it becomes much more vague, and it can be hard to really figure out, well, what does that really mean, or what does that really look like? So oftentimes when we think of labor trafficking, sometimes it means any form of exploitation that does not have to do with sexual exploitation. But very often the two are intertwined. For example, a domestic worker who's a slave in a house somewhere may be exploited for her labor, but may also be sexually abused by her masters or by the people that she's working for. So it becomes a very confusing term. So I want to tell you in more concrete terms some forms of labor trafficking that we've seen in Southeast Asia. So in that area of the world, and in other parts of the world as well, we have what we call the 3D jobs: dirty, dangerous, and demeaning. And those can be found in industries like fishing, manufacturing, mining, domestic service, and the list goes on. And I'd like to share with you the particular story of a young man, or a boy I should say, from Myanmar. Now, the document, this 10 Things You Need to Know About Labor Trafficking, focuses on a variety of stories of survivors. The issue of trafficking is very hard to document, very hard to find hard facts, so what we tend to do is we look to the people that we've been working with, look to the survivors to gather their experiences and their knowledge, and use that to try and understand what's really happening in these communities. So this young man, and his name, and I'm not going to pronounce it properly, but I think it's Cha, was 16. This was 5 years ago, and at the age of 16, it's a story that many of us have heard. He left home because there was a promise of good work where he could actually earn a decent salary. So he fled Myanmar and went to Thailand illegally with no papers. He didn't have any luck finding work. He was picked up by the Thai police because he didn't have any papers, and was transferred to an armed gang of traffickers. This group of traffickers took him and other Burmese migrants who were in Thailand illegally to a port, and he was sold for about $670 to the owner of the boat. He worked on that boat day and night. You read these stories and you think that you must be exaggerating, that can't be true, but he worked 23 hours a day at gunpoint just fishing illegally in a Thai boat that was operating illegally. And eventually he was in close to Indonesia, and he was there with some other migrants, and he was saying how he was treated like an animal, particularly because they were from Myanmar and they weren't Thai. They were treated as an inferior class. So one day, or one night I should say, he'd had enough. He'd simply had enough and was willing to risk his own life, so he jumped off the boat. He jumped off the boat with 6 friends. They were rescued the following morning by an Indonesian boat. They were eventually brought to Malaysia. And in Malaysia, he spent 18 months in detention because they hadn't identified him as a victim of trafficking, because that wasn't the kind of trafficking they were used to seeing. Eventually, he was repatriated back to Myanmar, and that's where he got in touch with World Vision, and we helped trace his family, reintegrate him back with his family, and monitor that situation to make sure that that really was the best place for him to be. So that's just one story, that's one example. I can't do that story justice in the amount of time that we have, but just wanted to give you a sense of another form of trafficking. We don't hear much about fishing, and we don't hear that much sometimes about younger men who are involved in different forms of trafficking. So why am I talking to you about labor trafficking today? Well, like the story from Cha, you can see that the response mechanisms that should be in place aren't there. And it's not to say that the responses for victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation are perfect. They certainly aren't. But we're starting to see some progress. I know at World Vision we're starting to see progress. We're starting to see change. Officials are more aware of it. Police are more aware of it. They have a better sense of how to identify it. And we'd love to see the same thing happen for victims of labor trafficking. There's weak monitoring. So for example, no one's out monitoring these fishing boats. They just can fly under the radar, where we're seeing more monitoring in the commercial sex industry. And victims have no access to justice. As in Cha's story, they didn't identify him as a victim. He was seen as an illegal migrant, someone who was a criminal who needed to be jailed or deported back to his home country. So this needs to change, and more than that, we know that trafficking for labor is the predominant form of trafficking globally. We know that for every person forced into prostitution, 9 are forced to work, 9 are forced into labor. So just elevating the profile of this form of exploitation is the goal of me being here today, and not to do it at the expense of sexual exploitation by any means. We're doing lots of work in that area, but to make sure that when we're addressing human trafficking, that we're looking at the whole problem. And what we've seen is actually this is sort of second generation thinking, I think, around human trafficking. When the protocol first came about, the world as a whole, NGOs and governments, were very much focused on sexual exploitation, focused on women, and focused on cross-border migration and cross-border trafficking. But as more information comes to light and more data comes up, we can understand that the problem is even bigger than that. So we need to make sure that we're doing all we can to address the entire problem. So World Vision is doing a variety of things to tackle this problem. It's a problem that we've seen in the communities where we work for a decade or more. So we do a few things, and I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but just wanted to share that our primary goal is to create a protective environment for kids. So whether you're vulnerable to trafficking, or vulnerable to child labor, or vulnerable to abuse in your home, we want to make sure that we have the systems and structures in place to support these kids. And that starts with the child being resilient. The child knows how to protect his or herself, knows who they can go to report abuse. We're talking with parents, making sure they understand some good parenting skills, some of the effects that their decisions can have on their children. Then working our way up to community leaders, local government officials, police officers, making sure that everyone is on board and they're all part of the solution. One thing that we do is we focus on safe migration. It's been mentioned before that people are migrating like never before, and when they embark on that journey, there are lots of risks that they face, particularly if they don't have the right documentation. So working with communities who have created their own watch groups where they look out for each other in the source points and in the destination points, and they stay in touch with each other and make sure that they're doing okay, that they haven't been caught up in something illegal or in something dangerous. Now in Canada, I've spent a lot of time pushing for and calling for a national strategy to combat trafficking. And as in the remarks from Ben Perrin, the government has committed to doing that, and they will be launching a strategy, hopefully sometime in the next 6 months. So I've been engaging in that process and encouraging them to look at two things in particular. Encouraging them to look at labor trafficking. We know that there have been large cases of labor trafficking right here in the province. So we need to make sure that any strategy or any plan that our government comes up with is sure to include that aspect and not just sexual exploitation. The other piece that we're focused on is the prevention of trafficking overseas for two reasons. Those children and those families over there deserve all the help and support that Canada can provide, but also because if we look at it from a prevention side in Canada, we need to support them before they're even brought here and are exploited in Canada. So we have some best practices that we've learned from our experience in the field, promoting things like birth registration. A birth certificate may be something that we take for granted here, but we know, and I've seen firsthand from my work in Haiti and the Dominican Republic, that a child without a birth certificate is a child who doesn't exist. And a child who doesn't exist is a child that doesn't have access to education, doesn't have access to healthcare. And that's a child who cannot migrate legally, can't access a passport, can't access a legal work visa, so has to find an illegal way of crossing a border. And that's where you see a slippery slope of risky behavior from smuggling to trafficking. So we work to promote birth registration, work to promote accessible education. So even if you are in a country illegally and your parents are working there illegally, you have a right to education in that country. And making sure that that education is available to you and supporting you with language skills. So particularly in Southeast Asia and Haitian children living in the Dominican, helping them to integrate and to be able to participate in the school process. In the Dominican Republic, Haitian children who don't have legal papers aren't allowed to go to school past grade 8. So what we're seeing is a cycle and a whole generation of Haitians who aren't able to get education past age 13. And they're there illegally, so it really limits their ability to gain access to meaningful and well-paid work. And then the same cycle will continue with their children, and so on and so on. The last thing I wanted to tell you about is we are launching a campaign next spring. It's going to be a campaign that focuses on the worst forms of child labor. We'll be looking at victims of trafficking in different industries, but also looking at the labor industry and the tourism industry. Sorry, the mining industry and the tourism industry. So I encourage you to stay tuned. We'll be looking at a variety of things from what we as consumers can do here, so looking at responsible consumerism, looking at responsible industries, and looking at what our governments can do as well. Because as we all know, we all have a role to play in this. So I encourage you to stay tuned. You can stop by our table and sign up for a program that we have to stay in touch with us. So thank you very much for this opportunity, Carly, and thank you for being here and sharing with us all day long. Thank you.